Steve Martin, Peter Sellers. Steve Martin, Peter Sellers. Steve Martin, Peter, Steve, Peter, Steve, Peter. But what do the critics have to say about this debate? Let's find out. It's not a bad film. Like I really enjoyed it. It's exactly what it sets out to be, and especially for, I think it's a PG movie. It's hilarious. Like the jokes it sets up, like the inappropriate humor it sets up. Some of the slapstick I think is really good. So let's start off with the worst. The joke is on anyone who pays for Z's movie. His Clouseau, rather than hiding his insecurity behind a mask of dignity, is genuinely smug. Instead of striving to imitate the great man he hopes to become, he thinks he has already arrived. So already this is a bad start. So you start off with an image that spoils the film, and then you dive into a character analysis without telling us anything about the film itself. This is a big problem, right? Because you're already comparing Martin to Peter Sellers, which is expected. I would expect that to happen. You haven't given us the plot. Already number one. This is a very different Clouseau from the one from Peter Sellers' Clouseau. And had Steve Martin tried to mimic Peter Sellers, the criticism would then be, oh, it's too similar. He's just mimicking Peter Sellers. Why didn't he make it his own? And so Martin did take a chance and kind of went the opposite way for the character itself. I think it did work. And I think it makes the movie its own thing, because this is clearly different from the previous films. It's a different Clouseau, a different time, different writers, different adventure, essentially. The warning signs come early, in the first 30 seconds of screen time. There are two opening slapstick bits, and neither works. That means they had nothing funny to start the movie. The thing about comedy is you can spend, 6-7 months working on a perfect scene with like witty dialogue and these cool comebacks and stuff like that, and that would get just the same amount of laughs as a perfectly timed fart joke, right? Like that's just how comedy is, and it's very subjective. The victims of Clouseau's clumsiness rarely include himself, just other people. I do like that last part. I think that's what makes Clouseau, I think that's what I like this film, is like, he is a bit of a jerk. I think that's what ends up working, because he's so smug in the beginning, and then he realizes he's been played. And that makes that scene much more impactful, because it's like, everyone knew he was a fool but him, and then he finally realizes it. And had he just been, this like kind of timid guy trying not to do the wrong thing, that wouldn't have worked. It's the fact that he was so smug that makes that scene in Act 3, essentially, of his realization, oh no, I am the butt of the joke, that much more impactful. This is a bad review. I think it could have been a good review, even though I don't agree with him. I think it could have been a good review. I think the big problem I have with this review is the way it's set up, this structure. Because he goes into some good points. I disagree with him on a lot of the points, but he gets into some good points. He should have started off with the plot synopsis itself, then go into the character analysis. But he never mentions that comedy is subjective. It's the most subjective art form there is. This is terrible, so it's a really bad review. Martin bumbles into fun. A French soccer coach gets murdered publicly here as a Pink Panther diamond is stolen. But as ever, the casualties that matter are all Clouseau's victims: Logic, the English language, and antagonized police chief Charles Dreyfus. Kevin Kline delivers like a pro, though his performance is dwarfed by memories of Herbert Lom. He quickly gets into the plot synopsis of the film. This should have been a little bit higher, but I think it's good. And he also mentions Kevin Kline's character. I think there's just the setup between him and Martin, because Clouseau is so like oblivious to his own ignorance. It just sets it up perfectly, because Clouseau's oblivious to his own ignorance, and then Kline's character is super vain. It's so perfect. I think that mishmash works so well most of the time in the movie. Highest marks in the foil department go to Jean Reno. And Jean Reno, it was a treat to see him in the film. It's so insane, because I've only ever seen him in pretty serious films. I think obviously Leon the Professional. There's a couple other ones I've seen. I don't remember now. He is, like he says, he's a really good foil to Steve Martin's antics, and it works really, really well. I'm glad that they paired them up together. And the fact that he's like a legitimate French person and he has to listen to Steve Martin's terrible French accent, that just gives me like a meta layer of comedy. I really like that. The script, co-written by its stars, is often clever, but the big questions are Martin versus Sellers. But even if you give Sellers the edge in facial expressions, Martin is equal in mangled verbiage. Martin's mouthings probably aren't for everyone, but I suspect the same people who will resist them would have panned the original films. And yeah, again, going back to the subjectivity of comedy, I do think while I enjoy this film, I can see why people wouldn't. Like, if you don't enjoy Martin like struggling with the French language and the whole scene with the hamburgers, like that always cracks me up. Yeah, I don't think you're gonna like it because it's just based on a real fish out of water situation, on a fish out of water that doesn't realize he's out of water, right? Like that's the premise of his of the Pink Panther film. Martin plays it off really well. He has a great foil. He has a great nemesis. His boss is another great nemesis. But yeah, again, it's comedic. The comedy is very subjective. If you don't like that kind of comedy, you're just not going to like it, right? And I think that's a really good point. It is weird that the previous reviewer liked the originals, even though he mentioned that they were uneven, because the Pink Panther films, essentially dumb comedies, and that's not a bad thing. That's not me dogging on it. It's almost like the Naked Gun films. Like they're really funny. The wordplay is really well done, especially in the earlier ones, and you have some crazy slapstick moments, right? And I think that's all it is, and this continues that spirit. I think if you want just a good movie to just like zone out on, like this is great, and it's just really, and the writing is, there are some scenes that are written so well, it's insane because you don't expect it because of all the slapstick and everything like that. It's definitely worth it.
Way to go!
Pink Panther roars with laughter. But what do you know, Steve Martin is just as funny. He doesn't try to imitate Sellers, but instead puts his own distinctive spin on the bumbling detective. So many of us may have forgotten just how hilarious he can be. As Clouseau, he is as peerlessly silly as he was in The Jerk. So this reviewer clearly is aware of Steve Martin's history, and that's a really good point. He mentions The Jerk. I do actually see a lot of similarities with this and The Jerk, which is weird to say. I hadn't thought about that, but it's kind of that same comedy. I would say a little bit more toned down than The Jerk, because The Jerk, I wonder what that was rated at. I don't remember. But definitely it's still like him going on just being nuts. And the fact that he mentions that Clouseau can be deeply touching, because there are those moments that like I mentioned before, that moment when Clouseau realizes he's been the butt of the joke and he's been being used, I don't know, that hit me. It's done so well because he's so over the top. The staging of the physical comedy in The Pink Panther is not always adept. Director Sean Levy is no Blake Edwards. But Martin, who co-wrote the screenplay, keeps spinning in his own orbit anyway. And what an orbit it is. Overall, a solid review. I think I would bring up the plot a little bit further up in the review itself, but I think this is great because this review actually goes into kind of like the mindset that Steve Martin brings to the film itself. What's behind his comedic antics, right? It's better than the character analysis of like, oh, who is better, Peter Sellers or Steve Martin? It's kind of like they're different. Here's why. Here's the approach that Steve Martin took. Now, you can still hate it, right? Like that's, like I said, comedy subjective, but at least it gives you a good background onto why it's different. So overall, this is a great review, but I'm really curious to see what the people had to say. Some scenes were too long. Learning to say hamburger, confrontation at airport security. I think the hamburger scene was perfect, so I don't know what this guy's talking about. What a disappointment. Where can I start? He should have dyed his hair black to match the mustache, or made the mustache white to match his hair. He seemed fake from the start because of this simple problem. I don't know about the whole hair dyeing thing. I think that lets you know, I think that's the whole part. That's part of the comedy. Clouseau thinks that looks good, but it doesn't. It clearly doesn't. It tells you everything you need to know about his character just by looking at him. Peter Sellers does it 100 times better than Steve Martin. This movie is a sham for the Pink Panther series. Yeah, this one. Not the son of Pink Panther, this one. Pink Panther is meant to be silly, humorous, and fun. The movie does it very well. Don't get too tied up in comparing the old with the new and enjoy yourself. So what's interesting is it seems like you either love this movie or you hate it, which means that there's something there to it, right? Like, because most of the reviews are either 1s or 10s, which is crazy. I thought it was going to be more middle of the ground, because that's what the original Peter Sellers movies, the reviews tend to be more like 6s and 7s and stuff like that. You never really get a 10 or anything like that, or you never really get like a 0. I mean, except for some of the later ones post the 1970s. What this movie has going over any of the other Pink Panther series movies, and the reason why I think this is probably one of the best Pink Panthers, is because it has Clive Owen as a potential James Bond. Because as we all know, he should have been James Bond. Series would have been great. Unfortunately, we got Daniel Craig, but that's fine. But his scene in there is just awesome. It's like they're kind of like nodding at it, because at that time, I think that's before Casino Royale came out. I don't remember. Or like he was up for becoming the next Bond. So I love that. I like how they poked like a little fun at that. You don't get a lot of comedies like this anymore. Unfortunately, what's ended up happening with like slapstick comedies or anything like that is like they went from like, you know, pretty like dumb, funny comedies, and they went the route of like superhero movie or something like that, where it's just so dumb and it's just reference after reference after reference. It's not even comedic, you know what I mean? It's like, it's sad. And so you don't see a lot of comedies like this. I think this was like right before that ended up happening. It's a really well done PG comedy that I think everyone will enjoy, and I think that's really hard to do, and you definitely don't see those anymore. So I would say go check it out. Sellers, Steve Martin, Peter Sellers, Steve Martin, Peter Sellers, Steve, Peter, Steve, Peter, Steve, Peter, Steve, Peter,